Lord be with you. Reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus entered the temple, and as he was teaching, the chief priests and the Pharisees came to him. Jesus said to them, "Listen to a parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence round it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his servants, beat one, and killed another, and stoned a third. He sent still other servants, more than the first time, and they treated them in the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, 'The heir. Come, let us kill him, and then we shall have his inheritance.' So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what do you think he will do to those tenants?" The chief priests and the Pharisees said to Jesus, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his produce at harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, 'The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes'? Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because the crowds regarded him as a prophet. The gospel inspired by God. 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth. So if you think that 1 billion years ago the sky wasn't blue and grass wasn't green and daffodils weren't yellow, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying 1 billion years ago there was no color on planet Earth. Because 1 billion years ago the eye had not yet been invented. The eye was invented 545 million years ago by a tiny little creature called the trilobite. So there were called the trilobite, a tiny, tiny little insect, invented the eye for the first time ever, 545 million years ago. So 1 billion years ago, before the trilobite, came into being, there was no eye on planet Earth. So there was nothing that could infer color from the electromagnetic spectrum. And so, in the absence of the appropriate witnessing consciousness, nature is not free to reveal particular aspects of itself. So we know, for instance, in quantum mechanics, when light is not being observed, it acts as if it were a wave. When light is observed, it acts as if it is a particle. There's a very, very famous scientific experiment called the double-slit experiment, and it's been reproduced tens of thousands of times. So when light is not being observed, it acts as if it were a wave coming through the slits. When an observer watches it, it acts as if it were a series of single particles. So it is the observing consciousness that collapses the wave down into the particle. You've all heard the famous phrase, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, does it still make a sound? And the truth is, it doesn't. If a tree falls in the forest, what happens is it sets up a series of air pulses. And these pulses can be, depends on what the frequency is. If the frequency of those air pulses is between 20 beats per second and 20,000 beats per second, it hits the tympanic nerve in the human ear, causes it to vibrate, and that sends a signal to the brain, and the brain interprets that signal as sound. But if the vibration is less than 20, it won't cause this to vibrate, and so the brain won't create sound. And so it's actually the brain that's creating the sound. So if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, it does not make a sound. The very famous Bishop Berkeley, he was an Irish bishop actually, after whom Berkeley here is called. He said, the only thing we can perceive are our perceptions. We can't perceive reality. We can only perceive, what the human brain does to reality, how it collapses it down, because the human brain is a particular kind of witnessing consciousness. And it is the witnessing consciousness that creates the reality. So there is no sound if it's less than 20 beats per second, or if it's more than 20,000, unless there's a different animal around. And a different animal, bats can hear sound up to 100,000 cycles per second. So if there's a bat in the forest, it'll make sound for the bat, but it won't make sound for the humans. But if it's over 100,000, it won't even make sound for the bat. And so it's the witnessing consciousness that actually creates the perceptions. Now, the very same thing is true of parables. It is the person who's listening to the parable, or the person who's reading the parable, that creates the meaning of the parable. And so here's this parable that Jesus taught this morning. He's in the temple, and the chief priests and the scribes accost him. What business have you teaching in the temple? Who gave you credentials to be, a preacher? Show us your credentials. Who gave you a license to preach? And so he tells this parable to them. He says, let me give you a parable. There was a very, very rich man who planted a vineyard, and he dug a wine press, and he built a tower in it, and he put a wall around it, and he planted his vines. And then he went to a far country, and when it was harvest time, he had made an agreement with a group of tenants. You look after this vineyard, and at harvest time, we'll split it between us. I'll send back my servants, and you give me my share of the harvest, and you can keep your share of the harvest. So he sends his servants back to the tenants, and the tenants refuse to share the harvest with him. They feel like it's their own, although they didn't plant it, they didn't dig the wine press, they didn't put the watchtower in it, and they didn't build a wall around it. They didn't do anything, it's just tend to it. But no, they're hogging the harvest. So he sends his servants back. They refuse to give his share to the servants. In fact, they beat them up. So he sends a bunch more, and they kill some of those. So he's really upset at this stage. He wants his share of the harvest. It's his land. He planted the stuff. He built the wine press. He made the vats. He made everything. So he decides, I'll send my son. They'll respect my son. And the tenants see the son come and say, this is the year. He only has one son. We kill this guy. He has no heirs. It belongs to us. And so they kill him. What is the master going to do with those? And the Pharisees walk right into the trap. Oh, he'll kill those guys, and give it the vineyard to some of the people who respect the agreement. And then Christ says, you are those people. So initially, if you unpack it, the first unpacking is that God is the rich man, obviously. God is the one, who plants the vineyard, and the vineyard is life, and then he makes a contract with tenants, and that will be the covenant. And the tenants would be, in this instance, the high priests and the Pharisee class. But they're not delivering the produce. They're not really giving people the fruit of the covenant. They're focused totally on legalism instead of love and compassion and stuff like this. And so when the owner sees this, he sends servants to collect his share of the harvest, which is about love and compassion and stuff like this. And they refuse to give it to him. And so he sends his own son, and that would be Jesus, and they kill Jesus. What's going to happen? So the first unpacking is, he's not talking about the Jewish people. He's talking about the leadership of the religious, of Judaism of his time. And he's saying that you guys who were given, you were the tenants with whom God made the covenant on behalf of everybody else, but you're not sharing the harvest. You're not giving back to God what belongs to God. You're not acting with compassion or love or forgiveness. You're bound in legalism. So I guarantee you, it's going to be taken from you and given to somebody else. So who's the somebody else? The Jesus movement. So it's going to go from the leadership of the scribes and the Pharisees and high priests to the Jesus movement. That would be in the first unpacking. The people who are listening to that, they're all Jews themselves. Now, within 300 or 400 years, it would be unpacked in a totally different way. The tenants now would become all Jews, and all Jews then are regarded as unfaithful, and so God is taking it away from all of the Jews, and he's giving it to the new movement, which is the Christians. That's a totally different unpacking. So now, the first people who were listening to Jesus, including his mother and his disciples, are now rejected as well, because they were Jews. They're part of the Judaism. So all Jews are rejected. That was the second unpacking that came 200 or 300 years later. Imagine you're living around the time of Luther, And now you've, in history has given you the Middle Ages, the extraordinary corruption of the church in the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries, where popes were murdering each other to get, elected to the chair of Peter. All kinds of skullduggery. Imagine the time when there's crusades going across Europe, and in the name of Jesus, who said, forgive your enemies, they're slaughtering tens of thousands of people. And imagine that you're present when the Inquisition is in place, and you're literally dismembering Christians because they don't believe in orthodoxy, and your name is Martin Luther. How would you be interpreting this? You'd be interpreting this as the tenants who refused to give the harvest would have been the Catholic Church, and now he's going to take it away from you and he's going to give it to somebody else. We're going to call it Protestantism. So no, that would be a totally different unpacking of it. And I would unpack it, you've heard me say this many times, I would unpack it psycho-spiritually. That it's not just about the Jews, or it's not about Roman Catholicism, it's the contract between God and every single one of us. And so the owner is the transcendence of God. And the tenants are incarnation. Every single one of us volunteers for incarnation. And the prophets who are sent to wake us up, are the inspirations we get, or the conscience we have, that which invites us into alignment with God. And the Son that God sends is the soul itself. And the soul, very, very often is rejected by the ego. And so what happens, it'll be taken from you and it'll be given to tenants who'll pay the produce at the right time. Who was that? That is reincarnation. You're going to get as many chances as you need to come back again and again and again until you finally get it. You're here to deliver a harvest, and the harvest belongs to God. And the harvest is about compassion, and it's about love. It's not about legalism. It's not about gratifying the ego in any way. And so it's a parable for the individual, every single one of us, that we're going to keep coming back again and again and again until we give the harvest that we've come to deliver to God. And we produce, the wine of the kingdom of God and bring that back to source. So to tie it back into what you'd said then, Margaret, the cornerstone is compassion and love. This is what God is about. And if you reject that piece and substitute instead, legalisms, the building is going to come asunder at the seams. The cornerstone is that holds the whole building together. You take this piece out of it, the whole building is going to collapse.
As you began your homily today with there was no color because there was no eye to perceive it, there was no sound in the forest because there's no ear to hear it, is there no backside to the moon because we haven't seen it?
Okay. We wouldn't know unless there were some... The moon itself, in fact, is like anything else that exists in the physical world. The moon itself is an artifact of human consciousness. Does a daffodil look at the moon? Does it perceive the moon? Does a grasshopper see the moon the same way that we see the moon? So it is the witnessing consciousness that creates reality. Whatever is out there, there's a fallacy in philosophy called the myth of the given. And the myth of the given says that our sensorium and our intellect create an accurate one-to-one map of what's out there. That's a total fallacy. We have no way of establishing that. All we can say is whatever is out there, given the sensorium we have, we've got 5 basic senses. They've got limited ranges. Every one of them has a limited range. Eyes can only see between infrared and ultraviolet. The human ear can only hear between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. The touch has particular. So for instance, if you touch this is not solid. In spite of what your finger tells you, it is not solid. It's composed of molecules. The molecules are made up of atoms. An atom is so empty that if you were to look at the nucleus of an atom, it would be like a grain of sand in the middle of a football stadium, everything else being empty. So why can't I push my finger through this? Why I can't put my finger through it is because the atomic structure of my finger and that is so chaotic that the tiny little pieces are bouncing around and I can't find the space because there's so much activity going on there. But if they were lined up, I could put my finger right through it. Our only sense of reality, this is what Bishop Berkeley meant, he said all we can perceive are our perceptions. We don't perceive reality, we can only perceive our perceptions.
That's true of us, but to say that something doesn't exist because I don't see it or hear it, to me sounds very egocentric.
How else would we know?
There's deduction. There's all kinds of
That's
ways
thought,
to find out.
but that's thought itself.
But isn't thought a way of perceiving too?
Of course it is, and it's totally biased. It's just it's as biased as our sensorium. Our thoughts come out of our cognitive processes. So we drink in whatever's out there. We have no idea what's out there. We have 5 modalities that suck in data points. We have no idea what's out there. They're sucking in the data points. It goes into this black box we carry between our ears. This processes it up there, and it creates our version of what we think is out there. But if this box were different, we'd be creating a totally different version. So for instance, when a snake looks at you, we had snakes in Kenya called spitting cobras. They didn't bite, they spat their venom. When a snake looks at you, it sees into the infrared range. So it sees the hot spots, your eyes will glow, if there's a wound on the body it glows, and that's what it'll aim for. So the snake is seeing into the infrared range. The infrared range exists, but the human eye can't see that. We can see, if you were to represent the electromagnetic spectrum as a line joining LA to New York, 3,000 miles, the part of that spectrum that the human sensorium can detect would be the diameter of a dime. The rest of it we cannot detect. So if our sensorium allowed us to detect the rest of the electromagnetic spectrum, there'd be a totally different reality out there. So reality is constructed by the sensorium and our perceptions. So it's the witnessing consciousness that's creating reality.
But something has to be there for you to perceive it.
We don't even know that. Maybe it's a total illusion. When somebody is having a hallucination, is there something there or not?
The first statement, there wasn't any color.
Right.
And then along comes somebody with eyes.
Yes.
Now, what about all the color that's here now? If we didn't have any eyes, if we ran around with some kind of funny thing, then there wouldn't be any color.
Unless there was another organism that had eyes. There's lots of organisms with eyes. All mammals have eyes, all insects have eyes.
There's green grass all over the earth, and that's because we have eyes.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
How much would you know? If I give you a big tub of, you're in the middle of the desert, and there's a big vat of water, and you're really thirsty, and I give you a fork. Can you drink water with a fork?
I'd stick my head in it.
What?
No. Can you drink water with a fork? If I give you a fork, could you drink water with a fork?
Yes, you could.
Yeah, you could. You could get a little bit out of it.
You could turn the fork the other way, and that has like a little curve, and it would take a long time, but you could slurp it a little bit.
It sounds egocentric.
It's not egocentric. It's sensory centric. There is no way of inferring reality except if there's a witnessing consciousness, and the witnessing consciousness determines what it can pull from
But
the
is
equation.
consciousness also using your brain?
Of course it is. That's where all your perceptual
You told me
modalities.
before that the brain isn't one of the 5 senses.
It's not a sense. It's a
Yeah.
it's a processor. It's processing data that the senses are bringing in. Yeah, and it's totally influenced by past experiences. It's influenced by your culture. It's influenced by your emotions. It's influenced by your expectations. It's influenced by what you're told is out there. And so, even we know from computer technology that 50% of the images which are projected onto the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe back here is where we project our visual images. We know that 50% of the images that are projected onto the occipital lobe are created inside the head. They're not coming from outside at all. They're made up by expectations and fears.
How do we know this isn't a dream? Maybe we're asleep right now and you're dreaming this.
It is a dream.
It is a dream.
It is a dream.
You're right.
Of course it's a dream. And we get that. It's not to say that dreams are not real, but there are dreams within dreams within dreams. I guarantee you, everybody who has the DTs, you take any alcoholic who's got the DTs and he's seeing spiders crawling all over them, that's a real experience for this person. If somebody else are watching him, do they see those spiders? They don't see the spiders, because it's the particular consciousness that's inferring a particular experience from particular data. So it's the consciousness that's creating the experience. Yeah.
As you're painting this, I see what you're saying, but I find myself wondering, but what about mystical experience? Mm-hmm. Because mystical experience, in my view, is transcending all of that. and really letting go of the mind and all of the senses and all of the expectations which are held in the mind and going beyond. So to be able to, for lack of a better phrase, touch the divine, all of that gets left behind.
You're absolutely right.
But the divine, are you saying that the divine's not real?
No.
That it's...
Not, the divine is the only real thing. So the divine is the only thing that's real. So I keep saying to you, life is a dream that the ego is having. The ego is a dream that the soul is having. The soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that God is having. The only reality is God. Everything else is a series of nested dreams. So you're absolutely right. Carl Jung defined intuition as perception via the unconscious. So whereas all of the perception is via consciousness, we drink in data through our sensorium, we process it up here, and we come to conclusions. That's how, consciousness works. The intuition is different. The intuition is not coming through the sensorium. It's coming via the unconscious, and so it's coming from a different source. So intuitive flashes, mystical experiences, they're bypassing the sensorium, and so they're leaving out a whole bunch of the dream life and going straight back to source. So that's why I keep saying to you, God is the only reality, but God is having a dream. And it's not to say the dream is not real. Dreams are real, but there's levels of reality. There are pristine levels. The pristine level is God, and the fourth or fifth iteration is this physical world in which we find ourselves.
So the way you're saying that our perceptions and our views and our cultural beliefs are really filters that filter God out.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Are we all seeing you in a different way? Because
of course.
Do you mean to tell me Margaret is not seeing you with the purple robe and the red sweater and a white whatever?
If she were colorblind, she wouldn't.
I think we all
Why
see
do you think?
the
Why
way
do you
you
think?
are.
Why do you think in a court case, Margie, when people are, reporting an accident, that there's all the different views? Everybody saw the same thing. We think, but they give totally different reports of it. Yeah.
No, that's different.
Yeah. It's not different.
Different from color.
It's not different from color. The only thing is, as human beings, our eyes are kind of constituted in the same way, so we all typically infer the same kind of color. But there are differences even there. If you're colorblind, you're not going to see what somebody else is seeing. But by and large, the vast bulk of human eyes are built in the same way, so they're going to infer the same kind of stuff. If you've got a totally different kind of a sensorium, it would infer it very differently. A dragonfly, in it has two eyes, it has 2,700 facets in each eye, a dragonfly. So a dragonfly flying over a field of flowers has a totally different experience from what a human being has, looking at the same field of flowers.
But the color is there that he's perceiving.
No, he's inferring the color because of his witnessing mechanism.
So that purple is not purple?
It depends who's watching, looking at it.
Do we all agree that
It's interesting. That's very interesting. Have you watched any of these videos that David is taking on a Friday morning?
No.
Watch it,
Yeah.
because this is blue.
Yes.
Is it really?
Have you seen them?
Yes.
It's totally blue. So David's witnessing consciousness is making this blue. Check them out. Go onto the YouTube. This looks totally blue every time, every Friday morning that it
But
occurs.
one of the reasons why it looks blue is you're standing in the sunlight and coming through the window.
No, but even down
is-
here, even down here, no matter where I move, it looks blue.
But that's the camera.
Exactly, because the camera is witnessing it differently. The camera is an eye. It's an eye created by human beings, but it has a different witnessing consciousness, so it's turning this into blue. Yeah.
And from a practical point of view, that aside from color is culture, how culture permeates our beings and creates, depending on what your culture is, you perceive so differently.
Totally.
And you're blind to sometimes because it's your only experience of culture. You absorb it, and sometimes you need to question.
Right, totally.
Well, some of it's rods and cones that
Yes.
are shaped differently in different people's eyes.
Yes.
And so that's a mechanism.
Yeah.
That's not a perception.
A mechanism is a perception. So there are several phases to it. There's whatever is out there and we can say nothing about it. Then there's ways in which data is absorbed by the organism. Some of those are sensory, some of those are intuitive. Then it goes through the black box up here. It's filtered through expectations, fears, hopes, cultural stuff, and then we interpret what all of this means. So it's going through all of these various stages, and that creates our experience at the end process. So your average man, for instance, can recognize maybe about 9 or 10 colours. Your average woman can recognize about 100 colours. I can't distinguish between, I can know red, green, orange, blue, indigo, violet, white and black. After that, yeah, I can't see the difference between pink and salmon and kind of whatever. I can't see the difference between them. They all look the same to me.
Why is there that big a difference?
Because men and women, there may be rods and cone differences, cultural differences. Men are not interested in colour as much as women are interested in colour, and so women become better at distinguishing. Like, for instance, a wine taster, I'm told, can distinguish between literally tens of thousands of different tastes. I got about like 4 or 5 tastes. I can taste sweet, sour, bitter, that's pretty much it. Or like a wine taster, when they smell stuff, they can smell tens of thousands of different variations on smell. The vast bulk of us are like 4 or 5 different. And so you can train yourself to be much more kind of discerning.